Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis on the state of affairs in Israel and the Jewish world. The war, the diplomatic tension with the United States, and of course, all of the different fronts that Israel is still waging battles on, from Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and of course, there's Iran, which is pulling the strings and orchestrating everything in the background. We're going to try to talk about all of that on today's episode. The interview I conducted is with Sima Shine. She's the former head of the intelligence directorate of the Mossad, of the intelligence division in the Mossad. Currently, she's a senior researcher and fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. And then I'm joined on a panel by Avi Gil, a senior fellow at JPPI and the former director general of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also by senior fellow at JPPI, Shmuel Rosner, writer, journalist, and jack of all trades, as I like to call Shmuel. So first we're going to hear from Sima, and then we are going to go to Shmuel and Avi. Here we go. Sima Shine, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Iran, but before we jump into, let's say, the nuclear side of things, which I do want to get to, I first, there's a lot of speculation, I would say, when it comes to northern Israel and Lebanon and what's going to be with Hezbollah. Is there going to be a war? Is there not going to be a war? Every soldier you meet is getting talks about April or May for the big war that's coming. But I'm curious, what do you think Iran's strategy is there? Because obviously they're pulling, to some extent, the strings behind, the scenes when it comes to Hezbollah. What do they really want?
Well, they want a lot, but if specifically to your question about the possibility of a northern front, full-scale war, because we have the front operating all the time, but a full-scale war, my impression from following very carefully the Iranians as well as Hezbollah is that both of them don't want to enlarge the war and to get into a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah. And I say both of them because I think at the end of the day, it's not Iran that is dictating Hezbollah what to do. Hezbollah is a major part of Iran's strategy in the region, and not only in Lebanon. And therefore, they are consulting each other. They take very carefully into account the positions of Hezbollah. They believe Nasrallah is the one who knows the region better than the Iranians, and of course knows, as he's always saying, that he knows Israel better than anyone. Yeah. Well, there is a big question mark on that, but that's what he believes. And I think this is the common strategy of both sides, Iran and Hezbollah, not to enlarge the scale of the war. Does it mean that nothing will happen on April, May? I also hear these dates, but that doesn't mean, because sometimes things get out of hand and it might escalate. But basically, I would say my impression is that neither Israel nor Hezbollah and Iran want to escalate to a full-scale war.
So, it was interesting. About a year and a half ago, I had an interview with Avi Gil as he was stepping down as chief of staff. And one of the things that he said that was quite interesting was that, the assumption that I always had, for example, for many years from talking with officials like yourself and others, is that if Israel were to attack Iran's nuclear facilities one day, Hezbollah would automatically, like within seconds, unleash its rockets on Israel. And what Aviv Kochavi said then was, don't be so certain. Nasrallah has his own interests. He has his own agenda that is not necessarily dictated by the Ayatollahs in Iran. So I'm curious, how do you see, and you kind of mentioned that now, that they have maybe, Nasrallah is the so-called expert. He sees what he sees. The Iranians see what they see. How much is the control of the Iranians over Hezbollah? Is it what I used to think? Has it changed? How do you see it?
So you are relating to two different, in a way, questions. Let me start with how much they are dependent, connected, what is the balance of power between the two sides, and then I'll say a word about what you asked Kochavi, because my answer is different. So I think that first of all, as I said, they are consulting each other. Of course, Nasrallah has a variety of reasons and of interest, and he has to balance between those interests. One of them is the internal situation in Lebanon, his position as part of the political system inside Lebanon. Of course, nothing in Lebanon happens without the approval of Hezbollah. We see around a year there is no president in Lebanon, and the government is a transitional government, because Hezbollah is crucial to any internal issue, but Hezbollah has to take into consideration the Shia community in Lebanon, the Lebanese political powers he has, and the and you know the Lebanon is there is a big question whether Lebanon is a state at all, because the situation is so difficult in Lebanon. No economy, no government for a long time, no president. So there is a huge question what Lebanon consists of, but still Hezbollah wants it to stay as it is. A state with the separation of power between the three main entities, Christians, Sunnis, and Shias. Now, when it comes to such a situation like now, that all the proxies are supporting Hamas, this is part of the understanding that Iran had with all the what they call the resistance group, the resistance powers,
axes or front,
axis,
yeah,
exactly, front. We haven't, you know, we knew it from before. We knew that they have established a room war in Beirut of all, with a representative of all those proxies. But what now we have is even papers and documents that were found in Gaza. And there we see a meeting that Sinwar had with his people, and someone there is saying, we have the back of Iran and our other friends. So we know that it was part of an understanding. But that doesn't mean that, first of all, I want to say one thing that is very important to understand. Hezbollah is part of the national security strategy of Iran. When Iran needs someone in the region to train and to go to talk to the Houthis or to the militias in Iraq, they send many times Hezbollah people. One, they are all Arabs; they are not Persians. Two, they speak Arabic and not Persian. So Hezbollah is in the region. He knows the language. He knows he is also part of the Arab world. And from that point of view, and in the proximity between Hezbollah and Iran, he is one of the tools, but a very important one that Iran has when it comes to its defense issues. Now, a word about what you asked, whether if Israel attacks the hypothetical scenario that Israel attacks the nuclear project in Iran. My personal evaluation will be that Hezbollah will immediately start a war against Israel. I think it is understood on both sides. This is the main tool and the main deterrence that Iran is holding vis-a-vis Israel. So I don't see it, they are building Hezbollah for what, if not for this doomsday.
Correct. Right. Which was always the assumption that I had. The Kochavi answer surprised me, but you know what I've learned, Sima, since October 7th is take everything that these military officers tell you with a grain of salt now. I want to move with you to Iran itself, where things have been relatively quiet. You know, they have somehow been able to carve out for themselves immunity from the Americans. The Americans are attacking the Houthis in Yemen, and Israel's fighting with Hezbollah and Hamas in Gaza and on the Lebanese border, but nothing happens to Iran. how much are they enjoying this immunity that they have? And we're seeing reports, for example, that they are upping and increasing their enrichment of uranium to higher levels, to that 60% level, which puts them just a jump away from military grade.
Yeah, you are very correct in describing the situation. Unfortunately, Iran is operating all others and keeps itself out of the game, and therefore out of any retaliation. I think there are several reasons why it happens, and when they thought that it might happen that they have made 1 mile too much vis-a-vis the Americans, when the militias in Iraq have attacked the Americans on the border with Jordan, and the US had 3 soldiers killed. When the response of the administration was that we are going to respond gradually, not in one attack, but in several ones. And the press was full with speculations that Iran or Iranian targets might also be part of the planning. Immediately, you saw what happened. Iran has sent the head of the Quds force of the IRGC to Iraq. He has been speaking to the militias. They decided to announce that they are not going to attack Americans. And surprise, surprise, 2 months or approximately 2 months, no attack on Americans in Syria and in Iraq. So on one hand, you see how much influence Iran and its interests are on the proxies. On this specific proxy. On the other hand, you see also that when it comes close to the Iranian territory or Iranian assets, they take 1 step back. And so there is a deterrence, of course, American deterrence vis-a-vis Iran. The question is whether the US is using this deterrence in order to get from Iran what the US wants. For instance, stopping the war in Lebanon, between Israel and Lebanon. For instance, stopping the Houthis from attacking the international maritime. So the question is, it's not always the same, but because Iran doesn't have the same influence on the Houthis as it has on the Iraqi militias or on Hezbollah. And I think, but it depends on the situation. Let's put it like that. I think as long as Iran understands that the US and the Brits and the coalition that was established are attacking Yemen and the Houthis, and nothing, in spite of the fact that they are saying that Iran is beyond, and that there is an Iranian vessel, ship that is giving intelligence to the Houthis. In spite of saying everything, as long as Iran believes that nobody will touch its territory or its assets, they stay aloof and they understand that they can continue. But and unfortunately, the US is not as threatening Iran.
So before I let you go, Sima, what would it take, in your opinion, for America to change that tactic? Not to go after the tentacle and the proxy, but to go after Iran itself? What would need to happen? Because if you ask me, this is the greatest mistake that's happening before our eyes right now.
Yeah, I'm going to disappoint you. I don't think there is something that can be done in order to bring the US there. Of course, if there is a major attack on US soldiers, of course, that will be differently. But as long as it doesn't happen and Iran understands it, I think what the administration now wants, first of all, they have too many wars, one in Ukraine and one in the Middle East. So 2 wars, too many. 2 wars too many. They don't want
a third. Yeah,
exactly. They don't want a third.
But come on. But they must know that by trying to avoid it, they're actually bringing it closer one day. Unfortunately,
could be. But I don't have to tell you. This is a year of elections. The elections are already on very high temperature in the US, so I don't think there is anything the US will do unless something very dramatic happens, and I don't see it happening.
Sima Shine from the INSS, former head of the intelligence division of the Mossad. Thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it. Okay, so Avi, let me start with you. And we heard Netanyahu on Sunday. We all know about this tension that's going on between Israel and the United States, between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. We all heard Senator Schumer's speech. Things are not looking good, but we're also heard Netanyahu on Sunday, who seems to really be staking out his position and not budging, and even, I would say, digging in his heels to an extent, right? He wants to make this out, listening to his comments, he wants to make this into I am standing up for you, the Israelis, against all these hostile countries around the world that are trying to bring me down and bring to an early election because they don't want, how did he say it? They don't want us to win the war.
Well, I think that what we do have here is merging of various type of considerations in both sides, in Israel and in Washington, which has to do with strategic concepts, with ideological concepts, and with military strategy. And to all that, you have to add the internal politics in both Washington and Jerusalem. In Washington, we do know the time of the upcoming elections. In Israel, we don't know the exact time. Well, we do know that it may happen in the coming month. So the both systems are gearing up towards this political moments, and it all has an impact on what we see and what we've heard Saturday morning in the Israeli cabinet in a series of interviews that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave to the international media. In my, the various implications of what we've seen, but I think that from the Israeli perspective, it's very important to notice that the notion which characterized Israel's strategy vis-a-vis America for so many years, namely to maintain the bipartisan support, not to intervene in election campaigns in the US, we are coming very close to deviate from that approach. And this is putting the Israel-US relations into a big question mark. And I think it's a very important development that we must address.
So, Shmuel, I'm curious, this kind of is happening. I mean, it's been below the surface and there's been some tension already for a number of weeks, but things have really escalated in the last few days. What I find interesting is the timing of all of this. Not just, obviously the elections in the US, they're fed up with whatever they're fed up with here. The whole, is Israel going into Rafah? Netanyahu keeps on saying we are, or is there going to be a hostage deal? The head of the Mossad went off to Doha, Qatar for another round of talks with the mediators. But there's another element which is thrown in the mix now, and that's the political element. And Gideon Sa'ar's breakaway from the Machane Mamlachti, from the National Unity Party. I just want to say in parentheses for a moment, I'm not a fan of his logo, of his New Hope Party. If you've noticed, it's, I think, an eagle or a hawk in this Jewish star. I don't quite know what he's trying. I guess he wants to be a right-wing hawk to some extent. But anyhow, it's interesting that this escalation is also taking place while this is happening. And what are the ramifications of this political upheaval a bit as well? How do you see all that?
Well, the more we see Israeli politicians maneuvering towards the possibility of election, the more the prime minister and his allies must have political considerations as they ponder the path forward of the war. Look, with politicians, you always know, even if it's somewhat disappointing, you always know that they will have political consideration in their heads as they think about the best strategy for the country. So we all hope that the strategy or the good of the country is still very much on their minds, and it's their most precious priority. But we know that they cannot neglect to think about the political aspect of things. I was watching just the other day, yesterday, when Prime Minister Netanyahu was interviewed at several American TV stations, and he was asked about Israelis' wish to have new elections, and there was some kind of back and forth with them saying, well, Israelis want new election, and him, the Prime Minister, saying, no, you misunderstand the polling data. They don't want new election because they know that new election will be harmful to Israel in the midst of war. Now, what is the truth? The truth is somewhere in between. About a
and
third of
Shmuel,
Israel-
you do these running polls for us at JPPI, so
Right.
you know what the Israeli sentiment is. Yeah,
Exactly. And it is in some way in between. There is about a third of Israelis who do not want election, who want election to occur in the slated time, which means 2 years from now. There is a third who want election now, namely 90 days from today.
mm-hmm.
And there is the third that's in the middle. They do want to see new election, but they're not yet comfortable about saying we want it now. They want it right after the war, or when they see some other developments, when Israel seems to be winning the war, they want to get some sign before they feel comfortable to go to a new election. So Netanyahu basically interprets these numbers as 2/3 do not want new election now. And is, the host on CNN or whatever, Fox News, wherever it was, interpreted the same numbers as 2/3 want election to occur before the slated time. And in both, they're both right. Israelis feel anxious about the situation. They have low trust in their government and their prime minister, but not all of them decided that now is the right time for new election. However, the prime minister knows that this sentiment is growing and that the undercurrents will probably force him into new election. So when he thinks about Rafah or about debating Biden or about praising Trump, which he did yesterday, in quite, ceremonial type of fashion, all of this has strategic ramifications and political connotation. You cannot disentangle these two elements.
What's interesting, though, Avi, you've spent a lot of time in the room with Netanyahu and watched him in action. But what's interesting is, talking about elections right now, he's also not willing to commit to elections after the war is over, right? Which he was asked over and over in those interviews, and he refused to basically commit that, yeah, there will be elections. And I think that the way I'm looking at it, I'm curious what you think, Avi, he thinks that he's fine, right? To some extent, right? He thinks that in the end, whether he's convinced that he's a victim of what happened or he's just moved beyond it already, but in his mindset somehow, this country does not need a new election. This country does not need a reset, and he can stay in power with the same government even.
Well, I think that what he plays for is time. He believes that the more time passes, then his political situation is going to be better. And therefore, in buying time, what he's doing is actually saying that having an elections now would damage the prospects to be successful in the war. And since Israelis wants to be successful in the war against Hamas, they should wait with the elections. And this is also the message that he projected to Schumer and to Biden and to the rest of the Americans, which are being seen as trying to impact an early election in Israel. So the bottom line is Netanyahu feels that he needs time in order to recuperate, and it's I think it's not rocket science to see it.
The interesting thing, though, Shmuel, is that while this is also happening on the ground in Gaza, things have kind of scaled down a bit, right? In other words, there are still soldiers, and we saw, for example, soldiers getting wounded over the weekend. There are still clashes and battles. Now there's like a very focused brigade level operation going on in what's known as the Qatari neighborhood, the Hamid neighborhood, a part of Khan Yunis. The north is still little operations of the 162nd Division, the 98th Division in the Khan Yunis area, but really it's much less than it was. Most of the Miluim, the reserves, has been pulled out. Some of the even standing compulsory units are now training or taken up operations and border patrols in other parts of, other fronts like the north. But Israel is keeping this on a low flame because there's two options, right? One is Rafah, or if not Rafah, hostage deal, then we scale back. So I'm curious if in your mind, if there is a hostage deal, which would require a 6 to 7 week ceasefire, is that the end of the war for Israel?
I'm not sure it is. That depends on what happens on the ground. I think Israel is serious when it says that it will not tolerate Hamas rule in Gaza after the war. So if a pause of 6 or 7 weeks means that Hamas can go back to power, and then Israel will have to withdraw from the territory and accept the old regime as the new regime, then the answer is no. Israel will resume hostilities after the 6 or 7 weeks are over. Remember that in the first hostage deal, there were many people who said, well, if we stop now, we cannot resume the operation, right, which proved to be a fault assessment. Israel was able to stop, wait for the hostage deal to be completed, and then resume the operation. I'm
sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say that just two differences. One is that was much earlier on when there was still a lot to do and higher intensity of fighting. And that's why I said things have anyhow scaled down a bit. And two, it was a 2-week pause. We're talking about something that's much longer.
Right. Yes, it will be more difficult. There will be pressure from international quarters that the war must end. And yet, I think Israel is serious about not willing to see a situation in which Hamas goes back to power. So what happens operationally after the 6 or 7 weeks, that's a huge question. We'll have to see what Hamas does, what Israel does. Is there another deal on the table? Because the 30 or 40 hostages that will be released are not going to be the last ones that Israel is worried about. So you can do one and then a repeat. You have to see what happens in the north as there is pause in the south. There are many moving parts here that will have to be sorted out before we can make a real conclusion as to what's going to happen after a hostage deal. But again, Israel is serious about not accepting Hamas in Gaza. Will it go into Rafah? Will it keep the Gaza Strip keep the north empty and the south crowded until something else happens? Will there be international pressure also on Hamas to end hostilities and on Hamas leaders to evacuate Gaza? There are many options here. I'm not sure that we can now speculate on what's going to happen after a deal. If there is a deal, if there's a pause, if all parties keep the deal and actually do what they're supposed to do, it's very speculative at this point.
Okay, so yeah, Avi, go ahead.
Just to add one more moving parts to those of Shmuel, and this is the internal politics in Israel. An hostage deal can...
that could be the sign that Benny Gantz pulls out of the government.
Or Ben Gvir or both of
Right.
them,
Right.
plus the possibility that it will force on us a decision regarding the exact date of the early elections. So all that would also impact your questions.
So I just want to ask both of you real quickly before we sign off. With the tension that we have with the United States, and both of you long experienced in America and watchers of politics there. I mean, look, the situation's not good, and that we all know. But do you think that the way I kind of look at Biden has two kind of nuclear options, right? One is the UN Security Council veto, right, which he could stop using or even go as far as to vote in favor of some resolution that's against Israel. And the second is to start to play around more with the delivery and shipment of munitions, but also spare parts to Israel. And that we're already starting to hear is anyhow started to wind down a bit, as is. Very short, Avi, Shmuel, let's start with you, Avi. Do you think that that's where we're headed? Is Biden going to be using one of those nuclear options?
Well, I think that Biden has a full package of potential leverages vis-a-vis Israel, and it doesn't need to start with an earthquake. But definitely, I would see, I think that we may see such measures being used, but again, they will be used gradually and maybe at the start without admitting that they are being used.
Mm-hmm. Shmuel?
Well, in this case, the fact that we are in an election year in the United States can play, can be somewhat beneficial for Israel, because for Biden to decide that he wants to have a real clash with Israel without knowing full well what will be the impact of such move on the electorate, that's a risky move. It can help him with some voters in Michigan, but
Right.
This will give a lot of ammunition to his rival, to Donald Trump, and could impact his ability to speak to some groups of voters in a significant way. So I tend to agree with Avi. They'll go with measures such as putting sanctions on more settlers or settlements, measures that will be annoying for Israel, but will not put Israel and the United States on a clash course. Again, it's not a great situation for either country. Then again, Israel has its strategic goals. And I must say, we were speaking here a lot about the way Netanyahu manipulates public opinion or making political considerations. Netanyahu is right when he's saying that the Israeli public supports his positions on the strategic matters and does not agree with the assessment of Biden or Chuck Schumer or all the other Americans who try to give advice to Israel. So on the merit of the situation, I think Israelis are much more supportive of the policy that Netanyahu conducts than the Americans seem to realize.
Well, as you both articulated well, lots of moving parts here in everything that's going on with Israel, with the United States, and of course with Hamas and all the ifs of what might if happen. So thank you very much, Avi. Thank you very much, Shmuel. Thank you to all our listeners and viewers. You can catch us for another episode this coming Thursday. In the meantime, we hope things will stay a bit quiet. Thank you very much.